Mandy here, clinical nutritionist inside the Body Reset program. Hey, I want to take a little bit of time today to go under the hood a little bit and talk about a very common issue, menopausal weight gain, how that impacts our energy and what we can do about it. We're going to talk about this through the lens of the hormonal change that happens, and this happens across the board for all women. So it's something that we really need to be understanding. And we're going to talk about how that hormonal change necessitates a nutritional shift in order for us to maintain our weight, maintain our energy levels, and stay strong and healthy in those postmenopausal years. So let's dive in. I'm going to break this down into 3 key parts so that we can really understand what's going on, how that's impacting our body, and then what we can do about it. So we're going to talk about the hormones first. We're going to talk about how those hormones create the issues that they create, and then what we can do to change it. So the first, there's four key hormonal changes that happen that we need to understand that explains how this process occurs. Okay, so the first one is that progesterone drops. Progesterone is a hormone that's only released when we ovulate. And as you kind of start going through those perimenopausal years, which is the 10 years leading up to menopause, ovulation is less frequent, doesn't necessarily occur every month. And when ovulation doesn't occur, you don't produce progesterone. So there's this natural sort of steady decline of progesterone. Now, progesterone has a really, really cool function in our brain and in our central nervous system in that it's very, very calming. So as progesterone drops off, our ability to cope with stress actually decreases. Now, our brain does adjust to this change over time, but it doesn't happen instantly. So for a time, as it's dropping off, depending how quickly we go through that transition, our stress tolerance actually significantly decreases, which means that things that you used to be able to deal with, maybe you can't deal with so well now without getting an elevation in cortisol. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So reduced ability to cope with stress, meaning higher incidence of anxiety, depression, and those sorts of things, as well as sleep disturbance. So that's the first hormonal change, the drop in progesterone. The second one is estrogen. Estrogen does 2 things. In perimenopause, it actually spikes several times, quite big spikes. So you get these massive, massive highs of estrogen. And this is, we hear this term thrown around, estrogen dominance. This is to do with these massive spikes in estrogen. And estrogen, when it's very high, elevates histamine. Histamine is that protein that is in our body that causes that reaction to things. You think of hay fever or seasonal allergies. Histamine being high like that can lead us to developing intolerances to foods that we never used to react badly to. And this is really interesting because when you're reacting negatively to a food, that's also a stress response. So again, you get this elevation in cortisol going on. The second part of that is that estrogen actually drops towards the end of perimenopause and into menopausal years. And when estrogen drops, our insulin sensitivity also drops. So estrogen keeps us insulin sensitive. Now, if we're insulin sensitive, it means we can use carbohydrates for fuel very well. We can get that glucose into our cells, burn it and as energy. So as that drops, our ability to use carbohydrates as a fuel source massively decreases. And then the next part of that, I mentioned there were 4 key parts. So the drop in progesterone, the elevations of estrogen, then the drop in estrogen, and then the 4th one is that we actually have an increase in androgens. Androgens are what we'd call male hormones, but increased androgens is what can be leading to another factor that can lead to that accumulation of fat around the midsection, which maybe you've never had before. So that's the 4 key hormonal changes that are happening over this time period. And this can happen quickly for some people. In fact, it might be instant if they have sort of like hormonal, something to do with cancer and they have hormone therapy to stop their hormones, or if they had a complete hysterectomy, something like that. Or it can be gradual as you just naturally go through that process. But regardless, the same hormone changes happen. Now, how does this actually impact our body? So in the terms of weight gain and energy. So losing estrogen, as we talked, estrogen has an impact on insulin, but another thing that estrogen does is estrogen helps us to build muscle mass. So our ability to maintain the muscle that we have, but also build new muscle, decreases as estrogen drops off. Why this is important? Muscle mass keeps our metabolic rate high. So it means that even doing nothing, we burn calories as energy rather than storing them. So if you lose muscle mass, you could be eating exactly the same amount of food, but instead of getting burned as a fuel source for your muscles, it gets stored as body fat. And so we see this so common, where people are like, I haven't even changed what I'm eating, but I'm now gaining weight. So that's part of it, is that we have that muscle breakdown that occurs. The second part of that is estrogen, as I mentioned, as it drops, decreases our insulin sensitivity as well. And this is probably the most common thing that we talk about, and one of the key reasons why we have to make the nutritional shift that I'm going to explain to you soon. Insulin resistance actually goes hand in hand with androgen rise as well. Androgen are those male hormones. So as insulin resistance increases, androgens tend to increase as well. So we can have that kind of going on simultaneously, both making the other one worse, which is yay for us. And then the last part of that is progesterone, which we talked about. So as progesterone drops and our stress levels increase, we have an increase in cortisol. Now, cortisol has a lot of functions in the body, and one of them is it's a catabolic hormone. Catabolic means it breaks down. So it actually breaks down more of our muscle mass. But also it can lead to the development of worsened insulin resistance and storage of body fat and whatnot. So this all sounds really terrible, guys. This is a natural process that our body is designed to go through, and it actually knows what it's doing. We just have to understand what it's doing so that we can support it in the process, okay? So it's not all doom and gloom. In fact, I want this to be empowering to you guys, because when you understand how it works, it all makes so much sense, and it's actually so easy, okay? So let's talk about what we can do to actually mitigate some of these not so brilliant side effects of this very natural process. The first one is we need to be eating and moving in a way that stimulates the building of muscle mass. So we know that because estrogen's dropping, because we have more cortisol and whatnot going on, our body is going to be more inclined to break down muscle than it is to build muscle. So we need to do stuff that takes it back the other way. That looks like protein intake is key. We're going to talk more about that. But movement becomes so key. And this is not going for longer runs, okay? Really doing a lot of cardio in particular is likely going to be more catabolic or muscle mass breaking down than it is muscle building. So we need to be looking at doing things that stimulate muscle contraction and muscle building. And this is resistance exercises, strength training, etc. So if you have never got into lifting some weights before, doing some resistance exercise, now is the time to start, because this is literally this that will change your life. I'm not even joking. It is so important, and everyone needs to be doing some of it. So there's move in a way that stimulates muscle building, and also eating in a way, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The other part is managing stress, all right? So we know that our ability to cope with stress is going to be slightly decreased because of that downturn in progesterone. So it's just a case of being aware that this is happening so that we can do what we can to mitigate that effect until our brain readjusts. Like I said, our brain actually, this is a natural process. Our brain will actually recalibrate and get used to the fact that it no longer has that beautiful progesterone coming in every month. And then our stress tolerance will possibly rise back up again. But in that transition period, however long that takes for you, and that will depend on how sudden it is, we need to be making sure we're supporting the body in a way that allows time for our body to really wind down. So this is going to look like things like walking, having maybe a meditation practice, or having some white space in your day and just not rushing around all the time. Breathwork practices, making sure you're getting enough sleep and not putting in things all the time that are driving the stress, which is, so synonymous with the modern life that we live these days. So managing stress, and I don't just mean, that can sound like such an airy-fairy thing to say, because there's some stresses we can't get rid of, but we can always choose to create white spaces in our day where we're releasing some of the pressure from that stress bubble, even if it's just 5 or 6 breaths before we eat a meal, to just calm down and digest properly. Then the last part of it is eating in a way that improves insulin resistance. So insulin resistance, as I said, is essentially where your body is no longer particularly responsive to insulin, which means when you eat carbohydrates, instead of going into your cells to produce ATP, our energy molecule, it goes to the liver, gets converted to fat and stored on the body somewhere. So rather than getting the nice energy that you might have once got from carbohydrates, you now just get tired and fat, which is no fun for anyone. So eating in a way that reduces insulin resistance is realizing that our body doesn't have that capacity anymore. And so stop focusing on fueling it with carbohydrates. Our body is wired to be able to use fat for fuel as well. And so we need to rely on this fuel source more. And this looks like keeping our protein really high and using fats, healthy fats in our diet as more of a fuel source, and keeping our carbohydrate intake more moderate, but also from better sources. So refined carbohydrates like a ground up flour or grain or whatever spike blood sugar very high. The higher blood sugar goes, the more insulin we need to bring it back down. Whereas, something like some kuma or some potato or some brown rice or quinoa, etc., because your body has to work to get the energy out of it, it's not such a sudden spike, doesn't require so much insulin to bring your blood sugars back down. So when you're having carbohydrates, we're looking at carbohydrate sources that aren't spiking our blood sugar, rather keeping us more moderate. And of course, backed up with plenty of protein, plenty of good fats, etc. The other part here, this is just a bonus tip for you guys, is it's not about how much, it's what's less about how much you're eating, and it's more about eating better. The tendency is that, you get to that point and you're like, I'm not eating any different and I'm gaining weight. So then you reduce and you reduce and you reduce, and you actually exacerbate the problem because your body no longer has the things there to maintain your muscle mass that it needs, that it's trying to do. And a whole lot of things start to change, and it just compounds the issue. So actually eating better rather than eating less is often a key. And it's about the protein, the fat, etc. And then how and where we time those good quality carbohydrates. This is something that every single woman should know. This is not something that we should just be learning as we're going through the process or we're out the other side. We need to know this stuff because this is happening in our body. And when we know, we're empowered to be able to make some change and go through that whole phase of life, which we so often dread, with a whole lot more hope and positivity, which is going to be helpful as well.